All right, now we're going to look at the filtration, reabsorption, and secretion pathway of urine formation in the kidney. So if you remember in the functional unit of the kidney, what was the name of that called? That was called the nephron, right? So nephron is this entire structure, and it's divided into these several regions. So when we look at the nephron, when we think about filtration, the first place and the only place where we have filtration that takes place here is in pink here. This is called the glomerulus. So I'm going to write G here just for the lack of spelling. So glomerulus here is this capillary bed that's encapsulated by this structure called the Bowman's capsule. This entire combination, so the glomerulus plus the Bowman's capsule, is called the renal corpuscle. And it filters out nutrients. So when we think about filtration, reabsorption, secretion, think of where the material is going. So when we think about filtration, the material is going specifically into the urinary system. So this is going into the nephron, as you will. When we look at, for example, reabsorption and secretion, you have to look at direction. So filtration takes it into the nephron, which eventually goes into which is the renal system. And then you have the reabsorption. So now everything, sometimes whenever you filter something out, the body's like, okay, we need that back. So this gets reabsorbed back into the blood. And then finally, the nephron's like, just kidding, we don't really need it, so let's secrete it out. And so secretion goes back into the nephron, which eventually goes out as urine. And so majority of filtration takes place in the glomerulus. That's taking place. Now, we go to the next regions. Now you have these convoluted tubules that are being presented here. You have two separate convoluted tubules. You have the proximal. What does proximal mean? Close. And you have the distal right here. So again, we'll go in every different section, right? But proximal is the close convoluted tubule, and then the farthest is called the distal convoluted tubule. Now, what happens here? So we begin the reabsorption process in the proximal convoluted tubule. And what I'm going to do to prevent any kind of confusion in terms of color, if I write it in white, everything is going to be, all this material is being reabsorbed. Anything in pink is going to be secreted. So reabsorption goes back into the blood, right? Actually, let's flip that. So if it goes back into the blood, I'll write it in pink. If it goes back in as urine, I don't have a yellow one, so I'm going to use white. The reflection here kind of makes it look sort of yellow anyway. All right, so the reabsorption process. What happens in the proximal convoluted tubule? So the material that gets reabsorbed is sodium chloride, salt, instances of water that gets reabsorbed. So water. What else gets reabsorbed here? Potassium, bicarbonate, and also nutrients, other nutrients that are presented. Again, I'll even draw the arrows for it too, so you know. So if it's going outside of the nephron, it means it's being reabsorbed. What is being secreted here? So what's being secreted is twofold. One is ammonia. So one of the basic structures of urea that we'll be talking about later is one of the components is to absorb urea and create it into stable molecules in order to release it out. Urea is one of the main components of urine. So ammonia, and also protons. It's hydrogen proton. And so what's being absorbed here, reabsorbed, is in pink. What's being secreted is in white. Next structure we have are these loops. We have the descending and the ascending loops. This is called the loop of Henle. So if I write here, loop of Henle. And the reason for this, later on, we're going to talk about countercurrent exchange, where this osmotic gradient allows for proper maintenance of osmolarity. But I'll create a separate lecture on that. So here you have the descending, which goes down, and then you have the ascending, which goes up, right? And so what's happening here specifically is that there is a presence of reabsorption of water. So this descending loop of Henle is only permeable to water. So water can easily come in and out, but majority of the cases it comes out and is reabsorbed into the bloodstream. When we go to the descending to the ascending now, there are these sodium pumps that actually pump out via active transport, so it requires energy, back into the bloodstream. So it's going back into the bloodstream. And as we go all the way back up to the ascending, so descending eventually becomes ascending, and now we begin our distal convoluted tubule. So the convoluted tubule that's far away from the glomerulus. And so what is being reabsorbed and what is being secreted? So sodium chloride becomes reabsorbed. What other molecules? Water. Okay, majority of water also happens in these regions. And then so you have bicarbonate minus, all right? But what's really unique about this scenario is that there is a secretion of potassium and the proton here. So what's unique about this region compared of the distal versus the convoluted tubule that you say? Well, you notice that in the proximal convoluted tubule, the potassium and sodium were reabsorbed. Here, in the distal, the sodium is being reabsorbed, but the potassium is being secreted. This region, the distal convoluted tubule, this is a region where aldosterone, if you remember, that was secreted from the zona, which one? Zona glomerulosa. And this main function, so this is a mineralocorticoid that is responsible for salt balances, aldosterone. And so its main function is to do what? Is increase sodium in the blood and decrease potassium in the blood. So it's responsible for sodium reabsorption and potassium secretion. So there are specific aldosterone receptors present on the distal convoluted tubule that allow for this exchange to happen. So it activates this exchange receptor where the sodium comes into the bloodstream, so it's reabsorbed, and the potassium now goes into the renal system and is excreted outwards. And then finally we get to this final region here. We have, this is called the collecting duct. So the collecting duct also reabsorbs sodium chloride. So there are certain receptors that bind here. But what's also really important is this is where majority of the water reabsorption takes place. So all these other regions that I showed you that have water reabsorption, this is where we see the most excessive one. And so what hormone do you remember was responsible for water retention? ADH, antidiuretic hormone. So you remember what the function of that hormone was. It allows for water retention. So majority of the water is retained inside the bloodstream. So when we look at here, there are specific receptors for antidiuretic hormone in the collecting duct. So in the last region, right before the nephron filters, reabsorbs, and secretes everything out, and afterwards releases everything from the collecting duct, antidiuretic hormone is a specific receptor that allows for specific aquaporins to open up and allow for an excessive increase in water. And so after every single pathway is done, now after it leaves, all this material leaves this nephron, now we have urine. So this whole pathway is showing you the whole passageway of the production of urine.